Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In this lecture, we're going to talk about thing 3. Most people in rich countries are paid more than they should be. And here I'm in very sort of substantive agreement with Chang's argument. And let me start the explanation by, excuse me, by talking about a personal story, which is with that when I was doing my PhD, a year into the program, I bought a used car because in America it's very hard, as you know, to take public transport, which is much sort of less widespread than in other places in Europe, for example. Um, so I went ahead and bought this car. It cost me about $45,000 if I $4,500. I'm sorry. It was a used car, about 6 or 7 years old at that time. In Pakistani rupees at the time, this converted, the rupee was at about 60. This converted to about 2.5 lakh rupees. In the same sort of car, four-door version of this car in Pakistan at the time, in the used market would be approximately, let's say, 9 lakh rupees worth. And so I was very happy that I'd gotten a good deal, and I went to get the timing belt changed. The timing belt is a component of your engine that in some older, especially engines, needs to be replaced after the car has run for about 60,000 miles or so. The part itself is very cheap, about $30-40. So I went to Honda and I asked them to give me the total work that needed to be done on the car. The response was that it would cost about $2,500 or $2,800. So I bought the car for $4,500, and just a visit to the workshop was going to cost me $2,800. I found a mechanic who did the work sort of an independent mechanic who did the work for much less money eventually, but still cost me at this lower lower quality workshop. It still cost me something like excuse me, I think $500 or $800 or so. So why is it that prices of these things, of the work that needed to be done with the timing belt, was so much more expensive in the US, and why was the car cheaper? And the answer is that in the US, cars are relatively easy to import. So if the local manufacturers are becoming more expensive, cars are being imported into the US with minimal tariffs and are then able to be sold there. So a lot of the cars being sold in the US are imported, although I don't know if this was imported from Japan or not. At the same time, mechanics aren't imported, right? And so you have to be an American national or someone who is legal to work in the US in order to work as a mechanic. And the timing belt requires about a day's worth of labor. So the car has to be opened up, the engine has to be almost completely taken out. It takes about a day's worth of work. So the point is that the relative prices or the relative cost of these two items, a car and labor, was so markedly different in these two countries, right? So a timing belt change in Pakistan today will cost you somewhere around 12 to 15, maybe 20,000 rupees at most. And here at that time, this guy was charging me in rupee terms at the time about 60 or what is it? About 50 to 60, 40 to 50,000 rupees for the same work. So the car was a third of the price that it would have been in Pakistan, and the labor was about 4 times as expensive. And this has to do with, of course, the fact that immigration is locked down. A similar example from the book is that a Swedish bus driver is paid 50 times more than an Indian one. And so again, you have to think whether that difference is because of the relative worth of the work they're doing. Perhaps the bus driver in Sweden is better trained, um, perhaps they have to work longer hours, or in other ways are doing extra work compared to the bus driver in India. But it cannot be that the difference in the nature of work is 50 times as much, right? So why is the Swedish bus driver paid this much? The answer is that in the market for low-skilled work, the Swedish bus drivers' opportunity cost, or what they could have done alternatively with their life, is the more productive alternative work that he could have done, or she could have done. So in other words, if you choose not to be a bus driver in Sweden and you go and do something else, you do work that is more productive. So perhaps the Swedish bus driver goes and becomes a security guard at an IKEA store. IKEA is one of the world's largest companies. The material that is stored inside is much more expensive, and so it makes sense that they would be willing to pay more for their guards than if the Indian bus driver had gone and become an Indian guard, where sort of it's possible that they're guarding something very expensive and so might be worth more, but it is less likely. And more importantly, if the Indian guard is not willing to work unless they're paid as much as an IKEA guard, if an Indian bus driver is not willing to work unless they're paid as much as the Swedish bus driver, then in India there are very many other people who are willing to come in and take that job, whereas in Sweden, because immigration is locked down, this is not possible. So before we go on, keep in mind that this story about if you go back and think about just the bus drivers, the idea that the opportunity cost is what drives the prices only pushes the problem one level back. Why does the IKEA guard earn more? Is that we cannot bring in the Indians or the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis or whoever else, more likely the Serbs and Croats, to come in and work in Sweden instead of the Swedish guard because of immigration laws. So keep in mind that the case against immigration is political. Remember, we said that markets, the extent of the market is politically defined. The case against immigration is political. And the question that societies have to engage with, the developed societies have to engage with, is whether the higher wages of locals who are competing with immigrants, the Swedish driver who will compete with an Indian immigrant, worth more, is politically or socially more valuable than the fact that your bus prices would have been lower, the fact that your security costs would have been lower, and so businesses could be more competitive. And finally, is worth the higher wage that the immigrant would have made. So if you have an Indian who moves from India to Sweden, worked as a security guard in India, works as a security guard in Sweden, they'd earn more. And so this is a matter of trade-offs that is again in the domain of politics and not completely within our domain as economists. Keep in mind also that people can feel culture being lost and may be willing to act strongly. And very recently we've seen that Brexit has been driven partially by the 3 million Europeans living in the UK, comprising about 4.5% of the population, and this leading to a lot of angst amongst the low-skilled UK workers, especially, who saw this pressure on their salaries as a consequence of this influx. So when Brexit happened, there was a big class divide between low-skilled people who favored Brexit and high-skilled people, for example, the London bankers and so on, who wanted to remain within the EU. So that I promised this would be a short lesson, is that about why people in rich countries are paid more than they should be. I'm going to skip thing 4 simply because I don't see it as central to the conversation about markets. In this chapter, Chang makes a very interesting argument that the internet has not been as important to society and to economics as the washing machine has been, because the washing machine freed up a lot of women who were previously full-time care providers or homemakers or housewives. um, it freed them up to join the labor force, thus substantially improving um, their economic contribution and having a large impact on society. In contrast, Chang argues that the internet has not significantly changed the world. I actually think this is archaic, and today we are actually seeing far more consequences of the internet. We've talked about how things like Kareem and the gig-based economy apps have changed the efficiency with which we're using uh, resources. But we leave this here because, again, as I said, this is not really central, and you can reach your own conclusions on this. I'll see you in the next lecture.